I want you to look at three things that happened in the last 24 hours and hold them in your mind at the same time. First, Iran fired 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and 4 drones at the United Arab Emirates on Monday. One drone broke through and set a large fire at the Fujairah petroleum industries zone. 3 Indian nationals were injured. The UAE sent emergency shelter alerts to every phone in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Commercial aircraft inbound to the country turned around mid-flight. Iran also launched 2 drones at an Abu Dhabi National Oil Company tanker navigating the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE called it maritime piracy. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain all condemned it in the strongest possible language. Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada called on Iran to return to talks. The G7 foreign ministers called the attacks unjustifiable and reckless. Second, America said the ceasefire still holds. Third, Beijing has not said a single word about the attack on the UAE. Everyone covering this today is going to focus on the first thing. The missiles, the fire in Fujairah, the alerts on people's phones in Dubai, the planes turning around. That is the visible event. I want to argue the most important thing that happened today is the third thing, China's silence. Not because silence is unusual, because this specific silence on this specific day, after this specific attack, tells you something precise about where this war is going that no press conference has said out loud. I want to take you through why that combination, Iran attacking, America holding the ceasefire line, and China saying nothing, is not 3 separate things. It is one thing. And when you understand it as one thing, the next move in this conflict becomes readable. I call the framework the geometry of silence. And once you understand how it works, you will read every Beijing statement and every Beijing non-statement differently from this point forward. Start with what Iran actually did yesterday and why the specific target matters more than the headline number. Fujairah is not a random city. Fujairah sits on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It is the UAE's only major port with direct access to the Indian Ocean that does not require passing through the strait. That is not a geographic accident. The UAE spent years and significant money building the Habshan to Fujairah pipeline, specifically so that its oil exports could bypass Hormuz entirely if the strait ever became unusable. That pipeline carries roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. It is the UAE's backup circulatory system for its entire energy economy. Iran did not randomly hit an oil facility yesterday. Iran hit the facility that sits at the endpoint of the pipe that makes the UAE resistant to Iranian control of Hormuz. That is a strategic targeting decision. It says something specific. It says the IRGC has calculated that the UAE's attempt to reduce its Hormuz exposure is a threat to Iran's leverage. And that threat will be addressed directly, not through diplomacy. Through fire at the Fujairah petroleum industries zone. Now add the ADNOC tanker. The Baraka, an empty crude oil vessel belonging to Abu Dhabi's state oil company, was struck by 2 Iranian drones as it attempted to navigate the Strait of Hormuz. UAE presidential advisor Anwar Gargash called it maritime piracy. Iran's state broadcaster quoted an unnamed military source saying Iran had no planned program to attack UAE oil facilities, attributing the incident to American military adventurism in the strait. Read that framing carefully. Iran is not denying the attacks. Iran is saying the attacks are America's fault. America launched Project Freedom, its initiative to escort stranded vessels through Hormuz with naval force. Iran fired on the UAE, and then Iran said America caused it. That is not a ceasefire violation in Iran's framing. That is a defensive response to American aggression. And here is the problem with that framing for the UAE. If Iran's logic holds, every time America tries to force ships through Hormuz, the UAE becomes the target. Not because the UAE did anything, because the UAE exists in the geographic space between Iranian missiles and American naval operations. Now America. Because the American response to yesterday's attack deserves precise reading. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed Monday that after Project Freedom began, Iran fired cruise missiles at American naval ships and drones at commercial vessels. U.S. forces engaged all of them. 6 Iranian small boats were eliminated. No American vessels or American-flagged ships were hit. Cooper said this in a press briefing. He described it as a successful operation. At the same time, the White House, through a spokesperson, maintained the ceasefire framework language. America did not declare the ceasefire broken. America did not issue an ultimatum to Iran about the UAE attack specifically. America said its forces responded to Iranian fire and that the situation was being managed. The UAE's foreign ministry said it holds Iran fully responsible for these treacherous attacks and their consequences. It said it reserves the full and legitimate right to respond. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan all issued statements of solidarity with Abu Dhabi. The G7 condemned Iran. The UN Security Council was being briefed. And America, the country with 10,000 personnel and more than a dozen warships in the region. The country running the blockade. The country whose naval operation triggered the exact chain of events that ended in fire at Fujairah, said the ceasefire still holds. Why? Because saying the ceasefire is over means something happens next that America is not ready to commit to. The USS George H.W. Bush carrier group is still en route, taking the long way around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid Houthi-controlled Red Sea lanes. It arrives in a matter of days. America's Tomahawk inventory is already reduced by more than a third. Its THAAD and Patriot interceptor stocks are at roughly half capacity after 66 days of this war. Starting Phase 2 before the Bush arrives, before the arsenal is positioned, before the diplomatic track is fully exhausted, is not the American calculation right now. So America holds the ceasefire language, while its warships sink Iranian boats in the same strait where Iran is firing at the UAE. Both things are described as consistent with the ceasefire, because the alternative is admitting the ceasefire no longer exists, and then having to do something about that. Now China. This is the part that is not in any press briefing today and is the entire point. China has made 26 confirmed diplomatic calls to Iranian and regional counterparts since this war began on February 28. Wang Yi has called Arachi multiple times. China has publicly called for dialogue, de-escalation, and a negotiated settlement at every stage of this conflict. China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have encouraged member states to work toward reopening Hormuz. China has done all of this loudly, visibly, consistently. Today, after Iran attacked the UAE for the first time since the April 8 ceasefire, hitting a major oil facility, targeting an ADNOC tanker, triggering the first missile alerts in Dubai and Abu Dhabi in nearly a month, China has said nothing. Not a foreign ministry press conference, not a readout from Wang Yi, not even a generic statement calling for restraint directed at any party. Nothing. Saudi Arabia condemned the attacks. Qatar condemned the attacks. Kuwait condemned the attacks. Bahrain condemned the attacks. Germany condemned the attacks. The United Kingdom condemned the attacks. Canada condemned the attacks. The G7 collectively condemned the attacks. And China, the country that has positioned itself throughout this conflict as the indispensable voice for de-escalation and diplomatic resolution, has not commented on an Iranian missile and drone barrage that set an oil facility on fire in the 6th largest oil exporting country in the world. That is not an oversight. That is a position. Here is the framework. I call it the geometry of silence. And I want to explain exactly what shape that silence is forming right now. China has built its position in this conflict around one specific calculation. China imports roughly 1/3 of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China has also built the economic architecture that keeps Iran viable under American pressure. The Dark Fleet, the yuan-based payment system, the teapot refineries processing sanctioned crude, the strategic reserve of 1.2 billion barrels built specifically so that when Hormuz closed and oil spiked, China would not be the country scrambling. That architecture produces a very specific interest. China does not want Iran to collapse. China does not want America to win this war decisively, because a decisive American win over Iran means American control over the world's most important energy corridor, and a demonstrated ability to collapse any economy China depends on whenever Washington chooses to. That is not an outcome China can accept. But China also does not want this war to go on forever. A permanent Hormuz closure is not in China's interest either. China needs that oil flowing. Its strategic reserve buys time. It does not buy forever. So China's ideal outcome is a settlement that leaves Iran functional, leaves Hormuz accessible to Chinese vessels specifically, and leaves America unable to claim it won the central strategic argument. The precedent China needs is not Iranian victory. The precedent China needs is American non-victory. A world in which American military and economic pressure cannot force a country to its knees when that country has Chinese structural support. Yesterday's attack on the UAE serves that precedent better than a deal would. Here is why. If Iran attacks the UAE the day after America launches Project Freedom, and the ceasefire is still described as holding, the signal to every country watching this war is precise. American protection of its allies is conditional on the cost of protecting them. If protecting the UAE means resuming full-scale war, America will hold the ceasefire language instead. Iran gets to hit Fujairah, America gets to keep the diplomatic framework. And China watches both and says nothing, because China does not need to say anything. The geometry of silence is doing the work. What does China's silence communicate to the UAE? It communicates this. When Iran acts on the target list it published in April, the list that named the Fujairah storage hub specifically, China will not intervene diplomatically to stop it. China will call for de-escalation. China will express concern. China will not call Karachi and say you have gone too far. And the UAE, which hosts significant Chinese investment in its ports, which has been careful for years to maintain economic relationships with Beijing, independent of American pressure, knows exactly what that silence means. The UAE is not militarily alone. America is there. But the UAE is strategically alone, in the only sense that matters. The country whose economic relationship with Iran could change Iran's cost-benefit calculation is not changing it. Let me steelman the opposing view, because there is a serious argument that China's silence today is not strategic endorsement but diplomatic restraint. The argument goes like this. China has consistently positioned itself as a neutral mediator. Commenting immediately after an attack, before the situation is fully assessed, would compromise China's mediating position by forcing it to assign blame. Iran has not officially claimed responsibility for the UAE attacks. Its statement blamed American military adventurism. Commenting before responsibility is fully established would be premature. China has called for de-escalation consistently, and its silence today is consistent with that role. It does not take sides in specific incidents, because taking sides would remove China from the table as a neutral voice. The steelman also points to the May 14 summit in Beijing. Trump is scheduled to sit across from Xi Jinping in 9 days. China cannot afford to poison that summit by making statements that inflame either side. Staying quiet on Monday's attack is China managing the diplomatic environment ahead of the most important bilateral meeting of the year. Patience is not endorsement, it is sequencing. That argument is coherent. China has been careful throughout this conflict not to make statements that would force it off the mediating perch it has constructed. And the May 14th summit is real, 9 days away, and consequential. But here is what the steelman cannot account for. China commented within 24 hours, when a Chinese national was injured in Tehran in the early days of this war. China's foreign ministry issued a statement, directed its embassy to provide assistance, and expressed concern. China found its voice immediately when the direct cost touched a Chinese citizen. An Iranian drone hit Fujairah yesterday. Fujairah hosts significant Chinese oil storage infrastructure. Chinese tankers use Fujairah as a logistics hub. Chinese shipping companies route through the port. If China were silent because neutrality required it, China would have been silent when its own citizens were affected. It was not. China speaks when Chinese interests are directly implicated. China is silent today on the UAE attack, which means China has calculated that the UAE attack does not directly threaten Chinese interests. And the reason China has calculated that is the guaranteed passage arrangement. Iran has confirmed that Chinese vessels navigate Hormuz regardless of the conflict's status. China's ships are not being hit. China's oil is not being blocked. China can afford to say nothing because its interests are protected by a separate arrangement that exists outside the ceasefire, outside the blockade, outside everything America has built around Iran. That is not restraint. That is the geometry of silence telling you exactly what China's position actually is. Watch 3 things as this plays out. The first is whether China issues any statement specifically about the Fujairah attack in the next 48 hours. Not a generic call for de-escalation. A statement that names the attack, names the UAE, and calls for Iran to stop targeting civilian energy infrastructure. If that statement comes, China has decided the attacks crossed a threshold that even its current positioning cannot absorb without comment. If no statement comes, the geometry holds. Iran can hit Fujairah, and China's silence is the permission structure. The second is whether the UAE moves toward China diplomatically in the coming days. The UAE has been hedging its relationships with Beijing for years, maintaining economic ties with Chinese port operators and infrastructure investors while remaining within the American security architecture. If the UAE's foreign minister makes contact with Wang Yi, specifically in the aftermath of these attacks, that is Abu Dhabi deciding that the country that can actually change Iran's calculation is not Washington but Beijing, and beginning the process of asking Beijing to use that leverage. Watch for any confirmed Wang Yi and UAE foreign minister call in the next 72 hours. Its existence changes the diplomatic geometry of this entire conflict. The third is the Fujairah pipeline number. That pipeline carries roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. It is the UAE's bypass around Hormuz. If yesterday's attack on Fujairah has damaged that facility's throughput capacity, the UAE's ability to route oil without Iranian coordination has just been reduced. Watch for any ADNOC statement on Fujairah pipeline operations. A reduction in throughput is Iran successfully closing the backdoor the UAE spent years building. It would change the UAE's calculation about whether a deal on Iranian terms is worse than no deal at all. Here is what the combination means, because that was the question the title asked. Iran attacking, America holding the ceasefire line, Beijing saying nothing. What it means is this: the ceasefire is not a pause in this conflict. It is a managed condition in which Iran continues to apply pressure, America continues to absorb what it can absorb without resuming full-scale war, and China continues to hold the economic lifeline that makes Iranian pressure survivable. Each of those three things requires the other two to function. Iran can only keep pressing because China keeps the revenue flowing. America can only keep calling the ceasefire intact because the alternative requires a military commitment it is not yet positioned to make. China can only stay silent because Iran's targeting list has been designed specifically not to hit Chinese interests. The three things are not separate events. They are one architecture, and the architecture is not accidental. It has been built methodically, over years of sanctions, over 66 days of this war, one rung at a time on the confidence ladder that nobody in any press briefing today is calling by its right name. The UAE is burning fuel at Fujairah tonight. America says the ceasefire holds. And somewhere in Beijing, in a briefing room that has made 26 diplomatic calls since February, and none in the last 24 hours, nobody is picking up the phone. That silence is not empty. It is the loudest signal in the Gulf right now. And the UAE, looking at the fire in Fujairah and the phone that has not rung from Beijing, already knows exactly what it means.